It was a quiet morning in Grand Rapids, Michigan, the kind where the world feels still, like nothing bad could possibly happen. But by the time the sun had crossed the rooftops that day, a woman named Stacey Dramiga had vanished, leaving behind a mystery that would grip her family, her friends, and an entire online community desperate for answers. Stacey was known for her sharp mind, her laughter, and her fierce love for her teenage son. She wasn't the type to just disappear. But on the morning of May 28, 2010, something shifted. Stacey was supposed to meet friends that evening. She never showed up. Her phone went silent. Her car remained parked outside her townhouse, keys gone, but her purse left behind. When police arrived, they found no signs of a break-in, no struggle, nothing. The place looked lived in, dishes in the sink, laundry in the dryer, as if she just stepped out for a moment. But that moment never ended. Detectives began piecing together her last known movements. Surveillance cameras showed her at a nearby convenience store the night before, calm, casual, buying a soda. She smiled at the cashier. Nothing seemed off. And yet, that would be the last confirmed sighting of Stacey Dramiga alive. Her friends began calling. Her mother filed the missing persons report. But from the start, something about the case felt wrong. Investigators initially considered whether Stacey might have left voluntarily, stress, mental health, or even a new start. But those who knew her dismissed that theory immediately. Stacey had a son she adored, a job she loved, and no reason to run. Then came the rumors, whispers of a man she'd been seeing, a relationship that had recently turned sour. Friends told detectives about strange phone calls, about how Stacey had mentioned feeling watched. Still, nothing concrete tied anyone to her disappearance. Weeks turned into months. Her face appeared on missing posters and on true crime forums. Her mother, desperate for leads, held vigils and spoke to the media, urging anyone with information to come forward. Then came a chilling twist. Someone claimed to have seen Stacey's car miles away from her home, parked near a wooded area. But when investigators arrived, there was nothing. Just tire tracks fading into gravel and silence. Online sleuths began dissecting every detail: timestamps, relationships, digital footprints. But for every theory, there was a dead end. And as time passed, so did the public's attention. Yet for Stacey's family, the pain never faded. Each year, her mother kept her name alive, refusing to let her memory disappear like the case files gathering dust in evidence rooms. But then came a discovery, one that would reignite everything. Months after Stacey Dramiga's disappearance, investigators were running on fumes. Every lead seemed to evaporate the moment they reached for it. But then, a curious detail emerged, a connection buried in Stacey's phone records, one that pointed to a man who had managed to stay just out of view. He was an older acquaintance named Greg Martin, a local contractor Stacey had met through a community renovation project. Friends recalled that he had been charming, helpful, maybe even a little too eager to stay in touch. At first, Stacey appreciated the help. He fixed a leaky pipe in her basement, checked in occasionally about home repairs, even brought over coffee once. But somewhere along the line, that friendliness turned unsettling. A friend of Stacey's told police she had mentioned Greg becoming obsessive. He called often, even late at night, asking where she was, who she was with. Stacey once said she thought he had followed her car. She laughed it off at the time, but her tone had shifted in the weeks before she vanished. Detectives tracked down Greg for questioning. He was polite, cooperative, calm. He said he hadn't seen Stacey in weeks, that he'd been out of town for work. His story seemed airtight, until phone tower data suggested his phone had pinged near Stacey's home the night before she disappeared. When confronted, Greg brushed it off. "I might have been in the neighborhood," he said. "I drive around a lot for jobs." But there was something in his tone, a casualness that didn't fit the moment. Investigators noted it in their report. At the same time, Stacey's social circle painted a different picture of her final days. She'd been under pressure at work, juggling single motherhood, and dealing with what her coworkers described as an uncomfortable situation with a client. They didn't name names, but the implications were enough to keep detectives digging. Then came another strange turn, a message retrieved from Stacey's old laptop. It was a half-written email draft, never sent, titled simply, "If Anything Happens." In it, Stacey mentioned a man who won't leave me alone, and how she didn't feel safe anymore. The email wasn't addressed to anyone specific, but investigators immediately thought of Greg. Still, without evidence of foul play, the case stayed in limbo. No body, no clear crime scene, just a digital trail of fear and a silence that grew heavier with time. 2 years later, a volunteer search group combing through a wooded area near the Grand River found something unusual: a woman's shoe, half buried in the dirt. It matched the same style Stacey was last seen wearing. The discovery reignited media interest, and once again, Greg's name resurfaced. But forensic analysis was inconclusive. There were no remains, no traceable DNA. Just another question mark. As online investigators revisited the case, they began noticing a pattern in Greg's past. Multiple women had filed informal complaints against him for harassment, though none had ever led to charges. The stories were eerily similar: unwanted attention, strange visits, a man who didn't understand the word no. Despite this, Greg moved on with his life. He relocated to another part of the state, started a new business, and rarely spoke about Stacey again. But her family never stopped searching. Every holiday, every birthday, her mother would set an empty chair at the table and light a candle. Then, in 2018, a private investigator hired by the family uncovered something chilling. Greg had once owned a cabin on a remote property about an hour outside of Grand Rapids, the same area where that lone shoe had been discovered. He sold the property shortly after Stacey went missing. When police revisited the site, they found signs of old digging near a fire pit. Soil samples were taken, but results were inconclusive. The property was later bought by another family, who claimed they'd found what looked like scraps of women's clothing near the creek behind the house. Again, nothing definitive, but enough to keep the case alive. By now, the story had begun circulating again online. But the deeper they went, the darker the picture became. The case had become less about what happened, and more about how something like this could happen to someone so ordinary, so trusting, so loved. And then a break, one that would make everyone question what they thought they knew about Stacey, about Greg, and about the night she vanished. The breakthrough came almost by accident. In early 2019, a data analyst volunteering for a missing persons nonprofit was reviewing archived police documents from cold cases. When he reached the section on Stacey Dramiga, something unusual caught his eye: a mention of a secondary phone. Stacey's official phone records had been logged and analyzed years earlier, but this note, scribbled in a detective's margin, referred to a prepaid cell number registered under an alias, Daniels. No one had ever followed up on it. Investigators decided to track it down. With the help of digital forensics, they traced the number to a disposable flip phone activated 2 months before Stacey's disappearance. The phone had been used sporadically: a few calls, a few texts, all routed through the same nearby tower that serviced her home. But one number stood out. A call lasting 27 minutes, made the night before she vanished, to Greg Martin. When questioned again, Greg denied ever receiving such a call. "That must be some kind of mistake," he said. "I don't even know what number that is." But the data didn't lie. The prepaid phone, now long disconnected, had been purchased at a local gas station just days after Stacey first told a friend she was being followed. Surveillance footage from that same gas station was long gone. The store had changed ownership twice, but the paper trail was enough to reopen the case officially. As detectives dug deeper, a disturbing new angle surfaced. Stacey had been looking into something on her own, quietly, methodically. Files on her home computer revealed she'd been researching missing women in nearby counties, all of whom had one thing in common: they'd last been seen near construction sites connected to Greg's contracting business. Emails showed she'd even drafted a message to a local journalist, planning to share what she'd found. The subject line read, "I think I found a pattern." But that email, too, was never sent. Suddenly, what had once been treated as an isolated disappearance began to look like part of something larger, a web of connections hidden in plain sight. When police re-interviewed Greg's former employees, one worker mentioned something that made investigators stop in their tracks. He recalled a job they did at a cabin Greg owned years ago. After the project ended, Greg had ordered everyone off-site for a few hours, saying he had to take care of something private. The man didn't think much of it until later that night, when he drove by and saw Greg's truck still there, headlights off, just sitting in the dark. The next morning, the area around the fire pit looked disturbed, freshly turned soil. The worker remembered because Greg had been unusually short-tempered that day, snapping at the crew for minor mistakes. When police pressed for details, the man grew quiet. "You think he did something to her, don't you?" he asked. Investigators didn't answer. In a final push to gather evidence, cadaver dogs were brought to the property. They alerted near the creek, the same area where scraps of clothing had once been found. Excavations revealed nothing conclusive, only faint traces of what could have been human decomposition, but not enough to confirm. Then, another detail surfaced, almost too strange to be coincidence. A letter was discovered in an abandoned post office box once tied to Greg's old business. It was addressed to the Grand Rapids Police Department, dated a week after Stacey vanished. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, almost rehearsed. "She's gone. You'll never find her. Some people don't know when to stop digging." There was no signature, no fingerprints, but the postmark matched the area where Greg lived at the time. The media caught wind of the reopening. News vans returned. Commentators speculated. Old interviews with Stacey's friends resurfaced, painting a portrait of a woman who had been trying to protect herself, but perhaps too late. Her brother, in a television appearance, said she was smart, strong, and careful. But she believed people could change. She didn't want to see the worst in anyone, even when it was staring her in the face. The renewed attention reignited old tensions. Greg, now in his late 50s, found himself under constant scrutiny. He appeared briefly on camera outside his home, denying involvement yet again. "This has ruined my life," he said. "I didn't hurt Stacey. I loved her like a friend." But online, the court of public opinion had already rendered its verdict. Everything became evidence in the public imagination. Behind the scenes, prosecutors debated whether they had enough to indict. They didn't, not yet. Without a body, without direct proof, the case hovered in that frustrating gray area between suspicion and certainty. Still, Stacey's family refused to give up. They held a press conference on the anniversary of her disappearance, standing beside a large photo of her smiling with her son. Her mother spoke softly, "Someone out there knows what happened. Please, let her come home." The plea rippled across social media, sparking a wave of amateur investigations. One of those independent researchers, a true crime blogger, uncovered something the police had missed. In old construction permits linked to Greg's business, she found a record of a property lease under a different name, one just 15 miles from where Stacey's car had been abandoned. The property had never been searched. When police arrived, they found the land empty, the structure long demolished. But what they discovered beneath the surface sent a shiver through every investigator on site. It was a piece of jewelry, a small, silver bracelet engraved with one word, Stacey. It wasn't enough to close the case, but it was enough to confirm what everyone had long feared. And in that moment, what had once been a story of disappearance became something far more haunting. A story about power, obsession, and the cost of being seen. As reporters packed up and cameras turned off, Stacey's mother whispered to the ground, "We found you, baby. Not all of you, but enough." By the time the bracelet made headlines, the story of Stacey Dramiga had moved beyond Grand Rapids. It became national. True crime podcasts picked it apart, news anchors speculated, and internet detectives dug through every record they could find. But behind all the noise, investigators were quietly doing what they hadn't done in years. Watching Greg Martin. They set up surveillance again, tracking his movements, his calls, his patterns. He was older now, slower, his once busy contracting business reduced to odd jobs and half-finished repairs. Yet he still drove the same model of pickup truck, dark green, dented along the passenger side. Neighbors described him as polite but distant, the kind of man who waved but never stopped to talk. "He keeps to himself," one woman said. "Always has." And yet, sometimes, late at night, they'd see him standing in his backyard, staring toward the woods, as if waiting for something to come back. It wasn't long before police noticed a pattern in his drives. Every few weeks, Greg would head out toward the rural outskirts of the county, park near a creek, and sit there for hours. When questioned, he claimed it was for fishing and thinking. But there was no fishing gear in the truck. Only a shovel. A search warrant soon followed. The property near the creek was combed again, this time with ground-penetrating radar. Investigators discovered an old metal barrel buried deep in the soil. Inside, they found burned paper fragments, some too charred to identify, others showing faint traces of handwriting. One fragment, partially legible, read, "She wouldn't stop asking questions." Forensic analysis confirmed the paper was similar to stationery found in Greg's home office. Still, without DNA or direct proof, prosecutors remained cautious. What they needed wasn't just evidence, they needed his words. His story. So, they turned to a tool increasingly used in cold cases, recorded confessions from the people around the suspect. An undercover agent was assigned to befriend Greg through a local veterans group. Over several months, they spoke often about work, loss, and regret. Greg, lonely and tired, began to open up. On a recording dated February 3, 2021, he said something that made investigators freeze when they heard it later. "She shouldn't have gone digging," Greg muttered. "She didn't understand that some things don't need to be found." The agent pressed softly, asking who he meant. Greg deflected, but then added, "She was stubborn. Thought she could fix everything. Some people can't just leave the past alone." He never said Stacey's name. But he didn't have to. Those words, vague yet heavy, became the closest thing to a confession the case had ever seen. Detectives confronted him weeks later, this time with every scrap of evidence they'd gathered: the phone, the bracelet, the burned notes, the call records. Greg sat in silence for nearly 3 minutes. Then he said, "You think you know everything, don't you?" When pressed again, his eyes narrowed. "You think she was a saint?" "She wasn't. She was obsessed. She couldn't let go." His voice trembled. "She ruined everything. My life. My family. My business. And for what? To be a hero?" The room went silent. Then Greg leaned back and said quietly, "You'll never find her." After that interview, he lawyered up. But it didn't matter. The damage was done. That single line, that cold, deliberate refusal, made the entire nation lean forward. True crime media erupted. Hashtags like #JusticeForStacey trended for days. But while the world debated guilt, Stacey's family cared only about one thing: bringing her home. Her brother, now older and exhausted, led a search team funded by donations. They combed every inch of the creek bed, scoured aerial maps, even brought in volunteer divers. One afternoon, near the edge of a dried ravine, they found a small, rusted key. It didn't belong to any vehicle in Greg's name. But when compared against Stacey's old apartment records, it matched a spare key listed under her tenant file. The odds were staggering. Prosecutors began preparing for what they hoped would be the final push, a circumstantial case strong enough to bring Greg to trial. But then, something unexpected happened. Before the warrant could be served, Greg Martin vanished. His truck was found 2 days later near Lake Michigan, doors unlocked, keys still in the ignition. Inside, investigators found a single note on the dashboard. "It's over. Let her rest." No one has seen him since. For weeks, helicopters swept the lake, divers searched the shoreline, and the FBI joined in. No body was recovered. Whether he drowned, fled, or was helped to disappear, no one knows. The case file remains open, marked active, unresolved. Stacey's bracelet is now kept in an evidence box, labeled Exhibit 14B. Her photo still sits on her mother's dresser, framed, dusted, surrounded by candles. Every year, on the anniversary of her disappearance, the family holds a vigil by the creek. Locals show up quietly, some with flowers, others with tears. And when the candles are lit, the air feels different, heavier somehow, as if the story itself is still alive, still whispering through the trees. If you've watched this far, thank you for keeping Stacey's memory alive. Stories like hers don't just fade, they remind us why truth matters, why silence protects no one, and why the search for justice never really ends. Please like, share, and subscribe if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Your support helps bring light to the stories others tried to bury. Because even after all these years, someone out there still knows the truth. Years passed, but the name Stacey Dramiga never truly disappeared. Even as other cases came and went, hers lingered, a question that refused to be answered. In the years following Greg Martin's vanishing, Grand Rapids changed. The old construction site was demolished. The creek where Stacey's bracelet had been found was fenced off. But the story lived on, whispered in classrooms, retold in podcasts, and replayed in late-night documentaries. For Stacey's family, life moved in quiet cycles of grief and resolve. Her mother, once fragile and withdrawn, became an advocate for missing persons. She worked with law enforcement to reform how cold cases were handled, pushing for the use of digital archives, independent reviewers, and public transparency. If someone had cared enough back then, she said during an interview, maybe my daughter wouldn't have become another file on a shelf. The community began holding annual vigils not just for Stacey, but for all the missing in the region. Her story became a symbol, not of tragedy, but of endurance. And yet, every few months, new rumors surfaced. Sightings of Greg Martin in other states. Anonymous tips claiming he'd fled under a false name. One even suggested he'd died in the Upper Peninsula and been buried under another identity. None were ever confirmed. What was confirmed, however, was the effect Stacey's case had on how people viewed justice. It showed how easily cases could be dismissed when the victim wasn't considered high risk, how often early mistakes closed doors that should have stayed open. Detectives who once worked her file admitted years later that they'd underestimated her. She was trying to solve something on her own, one officer said. She was getting close to something, and that's what scared him. The phrase, getting close, haunted the department. It echoed through true crime circles as a chilling reminder. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is ask the right question. Old files resurfaced. New viewers began dissecting timelines, analyzing phone records, and even creating 3D reconstructions of the last day Stacey was seen. The online community didn't just watch, they investigated. And then, in one of the most unexpected turns, an independent data analyst using modern geolocation software managed to remap cell tower data from 2015. The results showed that Greg Martin's phone had pinged miles away from where he claimed to be on the night Stacey vanished, directly between her apartment and the remote property where her bracelet had been found. It wasn't proof, but it was enough to reopen the file, officially, once again. As of today, Stacey Dramiga's case remains active under Michigan's cold case unit. Her name sits alongside dozens of others, reminders of stories half told, of people who never got to come home. Her mother still visits the creek. Sometimes she brings flowers. Sometimes she just stands there, listening to the sound of water against stone. I don't know if I'll ever get an answer, she said softly in one interview. But I know the world remembers her now. That's something. And in the end, maybe that's what justice looks like in a story like this. Not a courtroom verdict, not a confession, but a refusal to forget. Because for every unanswered question, for every silence that follows, there's someone like Stacey, a person who dared to ask, who refused to look away, who believed the truth mattered more than fear. If you've followed this story until now, thank you for being part of that truth. Your attention, your time, your empathy, they're what keep these stories alive. So if you believe every voice deserves to be heard, every mystery deserves light, please like, subscribe, and share. You're not just helping a channel. You're helping the fight to make sure no one, not Stacey, not anyone, is ever forgotten again. Because somewhere out there, someone still knows. And the truth is still waiting to be found.